Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day. What is Generation Y? Well, I came out with a new book today called Afterglow, Generation Y. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what Generation Y is. So you can grab this book. It's $2.99 on Amazon or $9.99 for the paperback. A lot of you have actually already read most of the book, and that's because this book is a collection of a lot of the short stories and the mood pieces and aphorisms that I've done on the channel really since its beginning, but especially over the last couple of years. So most of you have already read the book and are very familiar with it. There is some new content in there if you're wanting to get a few of the extra stories, which also means you could review it right now. So if you wanted to go on Amazon and if you like all of those Gen Y stories I've done, then boom, you can drop a review if you want. Anyway, what is Generation Y? So this is a somewhat of a contentious label the way that me and my friends talk about it. So I'm going to link another resource for you, a book edited by J.D. Cowan containing essays by myself, J.D. Cowan, and Brian Niemeyer, as well as some of the stories which are also found in here and stories that they've done in a similar vein. Really, Brian Niemeyer started it with a Gen Y tale that he did and really inspired me to continue doing stories like this. I've done a few like in the distant past, but it was really fun to come back and do a lot of mood pieces that explain the feeling of what it was like to be part of Gen Y. So Generation Y, like I said, it's a somewhat contentious label. A lot of people will say that Generation Y is the same as millennial. We take a different stance, which is that Generation Y is the generation between the late 70s and the late 80s, like 1979 and 1989, thereabouts. And it has a lot more in common with Generation X, which is the kids born in the 60s and 70s, than it does with the millennials, the kids who were born in the 90s and afterwards. So really the difference between Gen Y and Gen X is a difference of degree, as Brian Niemeyer puts it, and it's a strong difference of kind between millennials and Generation Y. Generation Y was the term that was used for us as I was growing up, as I was a teenager in the 90s. I was born in 1983, by the way, and it got dropped. It just disappeared and fell out of usage when media started to talk about millennials. And what they meant by millennials was not us adults. They meant the kids who were kids at that point. That was in the early 2000s. So the kids who were kids in and around the year 2000, really kids that were born in the 90s, those are millennials. And they have a radically different outlook on the world and a very different experience in the world. And that's because there were some very big changes that happened around the year 2000. And so I'll explain a couple of those. So the big one is 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center in 9/11, and thus the beginning of the war on terror under George W. Bush. So just like how whenever we're talking about generations, everybody's being born and dying constantly. There's no strict idea of what a generation is. But we classify and we group people in cohorts based on the similarities they have to each other, the similarities of their experiences. So you wouldn't put in with the greatest generation, the generation that fought World War II, people who were 7 years old in 1941. They were children during the war. They didn't have a full experience of what the war is. Obviously, they didn't go fight the war. They may have fought in Korea, but they didn't fight in World War II, and so they don't have that experience that young adults had at the time. And it's the same thing with Gen Y. Gen Y were kids who were teenagers or who were adults when 9/11 happened. And so Gen X and Gen Y, those were the first young men to go and fight the war on terror, the first generation of them. And it's a very sad thing to say that they were the first generation because we had 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan, which meant that there were men who fought in 2001, had children, and their sons went to the same place and fought in the same war. How wild is that? So Generation Y, 9/11 was big, but there's a host of other things that happened in the late 90s that radically changed the experience. So in the 90s, the internet existed, but it wasn't ubiquitous, right? Like in order for us to use the internet in the 90s, we had to boot up a computer that was really slow running, Mac OS 7 or like Windows 95. and you'd load it up and you'd dial in with the dial-in modem. You couldn't make any phone calls. No one had cell phones back then, or very few people did. People were just getting cell phones. That was like a cool thing around 2000, was to get that Nokia cell phone. And I didn't get a cell phone until after 2000. Anyway, it would beep and boop, and it would dial in to your ISP, maybe AOL Online or something like that. That you got a floppy disk in the mail, which I would just reformat those and use them as free floppy disks. And then you would slowly look at web pages, and you'd use like Yahoo or Alta Vista as a search engine. Google wasn't a thing back then. That's a really different experience of the internet versus your smartphone beaming Facebook into you 24/7, which is what millennials really got as teenagers and adults. We didn't have, the first time I got to experience high-speed internet was using computers at the university. It was not at home. High-speed internet at home was something that very few people had until much later. So our childhood was an analog childhood and a digital young adulthood. We were the first generation to really use the internet as adults and to have all of this technology kind of integrated into our lives as adults. I spent a lot of my time as a teenager doing tech support for my family because my baby boomer parents weren't big on computers. They didn't grow up with them, and computers were advancing so quickly at the time it was hard to keep up on what a computer could do or how to use it or what went wrong, all those sorts of things. So I spent a lot of time doing tech support for my family. That's I was a little bit resentful as a teenager, but that's just how it was. It's like no one taught them how to use it, yet somehow I just automatically knew how to use technology because I had been really raised with this progression of computers as I was a teenager. So yeah, we didn't have the ubiquitous of the internet. If you were wanting to look at pornography, for example, it was dial-up, like pictures slowly loading kind of thing. Whereas millennials and later generations have much bigger problems with pornography because it was so much more available for for them being teenagers and young adults. There's lots of other things too. The collapse of the music industry happened around the year 2000, and it was the result of Napster. A lot of people take a different view of this, but being a musician myself, I was fully aware of how the industry collapsed and how music sharing really affected that, which is that album sales really collapsed at the end of the 90s. So the music industry changed overnight, and I was a music major, so it went from an area where we knew there was like an established path for how you did things to no one knew how to do anything anymore. And that actually happened not just in music, but like across every art and really across every career. We were a generation that was raised to go to college. We were told every second, and not every second, but we were told constantly during our school years, during our formative years, how important it was to get a college degree. That college degrees were really important, that people who had college degrees made money, that you needed to go to college and you needed to get a degree. So of course, we were also the first generation to take on those massive amounts of student debt. I remember my first semester in college, I could write a personal check for tuition. Of course, I didn't because I was actually on a scholarship. My scholarship not only paid all of my tuition, it gave me extra money. They cut me a check every single semester to go to school because tuition was so low. But if you wanted to, you could have written a personal check. I think it was, for like a full load, it was less than $800 or something. And now you have to take out six-figure loans to finish a degree. So by the time I graduated and moved on into like graduate school, which I still basically had to pay for through scholarships and other internships and things like that, you had to go from you could work over the summer to pay your tuition to you had to take out a student loan because there was no way you were going to be able to work enough over the summer to actually afford to live on the money and to pay your student loans off and that sort of stuff. So we're the first generation to really take out big student loans, and the first generation to realize that our college degree really wasn't worth that much. Now, I knew many people, obviously being a music major, this is like most of the people that I knew, I guess, that got music performance degrees, got arts degrees, and then couldn't get any kind of job. No one cared that they had an arts degree. No one was going to hire you with a bachelor's required, because what they wanted was a specific bachelor's after the year 2000. They wanted a bachelor's in accounting or business management or something really specific to what you're doing for like a general kind of day job. And otherwise, it was all certifications. Like you needed a chemical engineering degree to be a chemical engineer, obviously. So degrees were either specific certifications or they just were worthless after we graduated from college. So we were the first generation to kind of inherit that. And if it seems like a lot of people around 40 years old complain about student loans, it's because we were told by every adult in our life to take out student loans because you needed to have a college degree, that you weren't going to be successful without one. And boom, turns out that was not the case. Now, to the baby boomers' credit, they assumed the system that they had experienced would continue forever, and that was obviously not the case. In fact, that's the big division between Gen Y and the millennials, is that in Gen Y, we remember how things were. That's why Gen Y is clinically nostalgic. I mean, like almost mental illness level nostalgic. And this includes me. I'm very nostalgic as a person. But my whole generation tends to be nostalgic for the toys of our childhood, the shows of our childhood, the music of our childhood, because, well, those things of quality are missing now. But more than that, we remember being children and not being loaded with all the seriousness of adulthood and having to claw out of mountains, or, clawing out of a hole that is mountains of debt. Weighing you down, and low job prospects. I know many people still in my age cohort that can't buy a house. They can't afford to buy a house despite having a bunch of professional degrees and have been working for 20 years. They still can't make enough money to buy any kind of house that they would want to live in. They're still living, basically paying rent, That's a really, really common experience. So that's why my generation tends to be really nostalgic, because everything kind of changed. There's also this thing called cultural ground zero, basically in 1997. And Brian Niemeyer and J.D. Cowan have talked about this at length. And with games, I put it at 2007. So we had 10 extra years in games, but in 1997, you got cultural ground zero. That is the point in time at which you can no longer expect things to be better than they were the year before in terms of arts and entertainment. All of the big series had already reached their zenith, and then they were all going into the milking stage or into the decline stage after that. After 1997, you notice you get very few big new blockbusters, and instead you get lots of sequels and remakes and Marvel Universe kind of stuff. What you don't get are like the new big movies that used to like blow out the box office, that came out of nowhere in the 90s and really start to taper off in about 1997. So you're experiencing two different worlds. That's what Generation Y is. We had a world with all of this abundance as children, and then all of this struggle as adults, because the world we were raised to live in didn't exist. It ceased existing. We were also the generation that remembered what it was like before Columbine, and for a lot of us after Columbine. The Columbine massacre changed a lot about the way people thought about schooling and the way schools ought to be organized. I lived on like an open, or I didn't live, but I went to like an open concept campus. There were no gates. I went back one year and like everything was gated off. There was no way in or out of it. Looks like a prison. Everything was gated in a way so that kids could not get on or off the campus because they were terrified of violence. So a high trust, we remember the high trust society, and we also experienced the low trust society. The other thing is, like, besides having this material wealth in our childhood, being the children of baby boomers, we also, this is why we're clinically nostalgic, we're missing a lot of our spiritual depth. So previous generations were raised in church. They went to church with their family. Our generation was the first family to be, or the first generation to have a minimal family and minimal spiritual life, where our parents, our boomer parents, were maybe holiday Catholics or kind of wishy-washy Protestants, went to church every once in a while, kind of paid lip service to the faith, maybe prayed sometimes before dinner or something, but didn't live the faith in a deep and authentic way that would be the case if you were looking at a lot of previous generations. And that's not entirely the fault of the boomers. I know with my family, a lot of the fallout from religion for my dad's family, my dad happened to be very religious, and we were raised in a very religious household, but most of my friends were coming in or out of church, they were all lapsed. Like everybody was a lapsed Christian is what it was like. It's like they had a lot of drama from the church, from their parents, and then everybody kind of fell out of the faith. They all became lapsed because of the imperfectness of church that they experienced with their family. In some cases, really scandalous things that only really came to light, much later on. Anyway, so we had a spiritually poor but materially rich childhood. So when you're struggling as an adult, you start looking back like, oh, didn't I feel good as a child? The answer is not really. You go and you gravitate towards the shows and the toys because those were the moments where you felt okay, where you felt like things made sense, where you felt like things were right, where you felt entertained and happy was when you were watching Gummy Bears or you were watching Transformers or something like that in the 1980s, because your parents weren't around. My generation is the daycare generation. We were put in daycare as little kids so mom could go to work, or we had to go to daycare after school. I know for myself, basically, I want to say like maybe age 8 or 9 onward, I spend at least 10 hours a day at school, at least, because it was, you're done with school, you have to go to daycare, mom picks you up at 5 or 6, then you go home. Not getting home till 6 o'clock at night and then having to do homework, like it makes for a pretty rough existence, and I didn't want to do a lot of homework personally. And I got in trouble for it too, like in elementary school, because it's like, David's not doing his homework, because I'm like, man, I just want to get home and play Legos. And then as an adult, or not as an adult, as an older kid, you had after school practice and stuff that kept you there till 5, 6 o'clock at night, no matter what anyway. So we spent all of our time away from home and away from our parents in daycare. And for a lot of people in my generation, this is not the case for my parents, but so many of my friends suffered divorce. Their parents got divorced. So they had a really unstable home life where they were having to go to see dad on the weekends and they were staying with mom. And those are two different kind of home experiences. Mom and dad are not together. That can create psychological issues later on, attachment issues. So as adults, Generation Y was one of the first generations to be heavily medicated, to use lots of anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressants, and things like that at unseen before levels, to where like 1/4 of all women at age 40, which is my generation, are on antidepressants. That's insane to think about. But as children, we were also heavily medicated. We were the ADD generation. So many of my friends were medicated because they were behavior problems at school. So they were forced to take whatever ADHD medication, or they were forced to take other psychotropic medication because of depression or some other thing that a psychologist diagnosed them with as children. Not thinking that, things like divorce are traumatic, school is boring and oppressive, and maybe medicating the child was not the first solution you wanted to look at. But our boomer parents were like, we want the kids to be normal. That's a big experience of Gen Y. Everybody be normal. Why can't you be normal? Everybody needs to be normal. You're not acting normal. We're going to give you drugs so you act normal. So of course we grow up to need more medication and things like that, because we were the first generation to be heavily medicated as children, the first generation to be heavily medicated as adults. So that's Generation Y. Lots of these stories, these are not essays on what Generation Y is. We've talked about it a lot on my site, dvspress.com, brianniemeyer.com, Wasteland and Sky, that's J.D. Cowan's website. If you just read that, if you read J.D. Cowan's book, Generation Y, The New Lost Generation, there's a lot of these discussions about our experiences and why we define it from 78 to 88 or 79 to 89. Because it's really different if you're younger. If you're millennial or Gen Z, it's really different. A 10-year window works really good now because we have this accelerating change. So maybe 20 years was a good cohort far in the past because things weren't changing that much in 20 years. But now 10 years is big. Imagine going back and saying like somebody born in 2002 is going to have the same experience as somebody born in 2022. Probably not at all. So someone born in 1992 had a very different experience from someone born in 1982, and a very different experience from somebody born in 2002. So I would say, Gen X, late 60s to late 70s, Gen Y, late 70s to late 80s, millennials, 90s kids, and, Gen Z, 2000s kids. And I don't know what we call the next generation that's up and coming, but I know that Gen Z or the Zoomers, they have their own problems, and I don't, this video is now going on to 20 minutes, kind of pontificating on what Gen Y was. They have their own problems, but each cohort has their own issues and their own attitudes that you see emerge. And the millennials, for them, it's everything's year zero, and for Gen Y, it's everything's 1995. Everything's like, we got to go back to the 80s. Everything's 1988, 1995, right? That's what Gen Y is obsessed with, is the past. And so this book is in a lot of ways about letting go of that and about what that means for us, and the warnings about if we're not going to grow as people and be able to move past some of these attachments that we have to the past and think about the future. Now, I'm an author. Obviously, I write books, so I'm thinking of the future. What am I going to do next? My books are what they are. They're an expression of who I am. They're not me trying to recapture anything about the 80s or the 90s. They're based, especially my fantasy books, they're based in the fantasy tradition, going all the way back to something like Lord Dunsany, right? So check them out, and check out Afterglow Generation Y. And lastly, I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the video, Eyes in the Walls, another Gen Y book I did. I don't have it right here. I should really have it if I'm going to talk about it. Eyes in the Walls takes place in 1991. It's very much a book about Generation Y, but it's a horror book and it's a monster story. You guys will love it. It has a great ending. Most of the people who read it really enjoy this book. It is free today through Sunday to coincide with this book. So you can get all three books. You can get Generation Y, The New Lost Generation. That one's free, edited by J.D. Cowan. Afterglow Generation Y, of course, a collection of my stories and my aphorisms and mood pieces. And then, of course, you can get Eyes in the Walls, a complete horror narrative that will really knock your socks off with the ending, hopefully. That's the main takeaway I get from the reviews, like, whoa, that ending. And I'm really proud of how I ended the book. So check it out and let me know what you think about it. Of course, if you've listened to all of the mood pieces over the last couple of years, you've read most of the book. Check out the new stuff, and I'll see you next time. Have a great one.